This is our 14th lesson on Introduction to the Bible. Last lesson we looked at the Hebrew and Aramaic languages, and just a little bit about the Greek language, but we're going to be looking at the Greek language today, the New Testament language of the New Testament. Most of the New Testament was written in Greek. There are a few words here and there in Aramaic, and so we do have some claims by some that the Roman Catholics, for example, and the Muslims, some of the Muslims claim that Jesus only spoke Aramaic and that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic. The problem is that they completely discount the possibility that since Jesus is deity, he could speak any language that there was. So they assume that he grew up with Aramaic, and they've taken the assumption like an atheist would assume, or an agnostic, about Jesus. If he's deity, he can speak any language that there is because he created the languages. So they wouldn't have a problem with him speaking Greek fluently because of his nature. He's deity. He's God in the flesh. He's God incarnate. And they say he only spoke Aramaic. Again, of course, they're thinking he's just merely a man. And of course, that's wrong. There's no evidence that this is the case. And both Roman Catholics and Muslims base some of their fundamental doctrinal errors about the Bible on this claim. And so that's the error, and they're trying to support an error. Claim the New Testament is written in Aramaic, use this claim to prove that the Greek New Testament is not inspired of God, not inerrant. So, because it goes contrary to some of their doctrine. And therefore, to prove that we cannot trust the New Testament, Greek New Testament, we must follow their writings, the Roman Catholic traditions, or the Quran, the Muslims. So that's what that's all about. But again, they make this claim, but they don't supply any evidence to support it. Evidence, just pure begging the question. Let's look at the Greek languages now. It's pre-Homeric, prior to the time of Homer. Homer lived about 1000 BC, approximately the time of King David or King Saul, when we're thereabouts. And up to about 1000 BC, they classified as pre-Homeric. Then we have the classical period of Greek, where Greek was divided into languages, different dialects because of the city-states. And so there's different words and different way of saying things. This existed from about 1000 BC, time of Homer, to about 330 BC. And this is when Greek began to be spread throughout the Macedonian Empire that was under the Great formed and founded. Greek became a second language to the people in the empire. And as a second language, they dumbed it down, or they simplified the language. So the language then was changed a bit from the old classical to what we know as Koine, which is the Greek word for common or ordinary, the common Greek. And this existed from about 330 BC to about 330 AD. That it went for about 600 years, approximately, between 600 and 700 years. And the Byzantine period began in about AD 330 and ended in 1453, AD 1453, when the Turks or Muslims overran Byzantium. And they began to control that. The Roman Empire had split into two divisions, and the eastern part of the empire was the Byzantine Empire, and the Turks overran it around 1453 BC. A lot of the people that were Eastern Orthodox, they fled away from the Muslims and took their Bibles with them, the Greek Bibles. That's when Greek began to be studied quite seriously in the Western world, because all of these people came from when the Turks took over the empire and they began to rule that, those people fled and came to the West, brought the Greek Bibles with them. And modern Greek began about 1453 BC until the present time. And so there are differences in languages, as there would be over this period of time for about 3,000 years, a little over 3,000 years, just from the classical period up to what we have now. Very little known about the pre-Homeric Greek because there's no literary remains of this language as far as I know. During the classical period, Greek developed several dialects because the Greek people formed city-states. They had a system of government called democracy, and the Romans had a system of government called a republic. And our government in the United States is a constitutional republic. It's not a democracy. And but the Greeks had a democracy, the majority rules. But our government is the Constitution, and written it protects the minorities from a dictatorial rule by the majority. So it gives rights to the people. And but the Greeks had democracy, and these city-states were formed, and so they had kings and so forth, but they introduced democracy. The main dialects were Aeolic, Doric, and Ionic, and Attic. These were your four main dialects, and they had different structure and their functioning of the words. The Aeolic dialect is only found in poetry, such as Sappho. And so it's found there, and it's mostly been lost. The Doric dialect is only found in poetry, Pindar and Theocritus, and these are examples of it. The Ionic dialects found in Homer, Hesiod, Herodotus, and Hippocrates. And so these are examples of that Ionic dialect. Again, these are all classical Greek. The Attic dialect came from the Ionic. So it flowed out of the Ionic. It was the dialect of Athens, and since Athens was such an influential city, a city of great learning and so forth, it was predominant over the other dialects. This, of course, is the classical period before, as of the great spread to worldwide empire, at least. And now we have the Koine Greek, which began about 330 BC. Now at the end of the classical, the Koine came. Of course, that started when Alexander the Great made Greek a second language to a lot of nations that he overran. The first level, there are 4 levels of Koine Greek. Unfortunately, a lot of writers only have 3 in their writing, but there are really 4 levels. The first level was the street level of the common people, the language of the papyri. And papyrus, a lot of papyrus documents, most of them, those papyrus documents are found in Egypt or in places where it gets very dry, so the papyrus won't decay. But places where it gets moist enough, it would have long decayed. It's just plant material. And so the first level was the street level of common people. People that couldn't read and write would hire a scribe to write letters for them. And there's a standard form of the letters, and we'll go through that later as we get into this more fully. Second level, I think we went through that already. I think I cited a source for that, but there's been some other books been written since that book around 1920 or somewhere I quoted. I cited earlier lesson. The second level was the spoken language of the educated people. Now, this is a level that's not been recognized by most of the Greek scholars. And so they've not recognized this, but the evidence is strong, I believe, that this is another level. The educated people had a level of which they spoke, And then the third level was the writings of the educated people, the literary level. And there's a difference in those two. The person that writes, he may have a more complicated sentence. There was a fourth level, was the artistic, where they tried to revive the classical Greek. As people were fighting against this change and this dumbing down of their language, and it was a losing battle. Our English language is being dumbed down right now because it's a second language to a lot of people in the world, and they want it simpler than what we have it. So they've simplified things and made things actually where they're not as exact, not as clear. But there were people trying to hang on to the old artistic language form of the Greek, the old classical Greek, what they're trying to hold up, hang on to. So our third level is the level in which, our second level, I'm sorry, is the level in which the New Testament is written. Daniel Wallace, I think he's one of the renowned Greek authorities of our time, or living authorities right now. As we argued earlier, the Greek of the New Testament is neither on the level of the papyri nor on the level of the literary Koine, but it's conversational Greek. That many scholars seem to be unaware of this intermediate level is part of the reason there is confusion over the nature of the New Testament Greek. See? So they go to the papyrus documents to get information about the structure of the Greek grammar and syntax. The problem is that the grammar and syntax is simpler than the language of educated people. These are the common street language. And so if we took street English versus the language of educated people when they're speaking, they won't use some of the problems. They won't use the language the same way. There'll be a different way of expressing themselves. Wallace on page 22, on page 27. So, Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics is the name of the book. Back to page 21, he says, he's talking about conversational Koine. Typically the spoken language of the educated people. It is grammatically correct for the most part, but not to the same literary level. It lacks subtleties. It's more explicit, has shorter sentences, more paradoxes. We'd have to look into all of this, what they're talking about here, as literary Koine. By its very nature, one would not expect to find many parallels in this, either in the papyri, used the language of uneducated people, or among literary authors, with the language of the written language. I know I've written several books, and in my writing, I probably use bigger words sometimes because they fulfill the purpose. I figure a person can look in the glossary of my book or in a dictionary if I use some words. Some of the materials or the sentences are probably a little more complicated than they are when I speak. And so that's what we run into here. And so what we have here is he is claiming, and others make this claim as well, that the language of the New Testament is not the same as the papyrus documents that they're looking at. And that's the language of the uneducated people, the street language. Right? And let's look at some characteristics of the Greek language of the New Testament. There were no punctuation marks in the early Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, in Ephesians 1:13 and 14, there is a punctuation mark in several of the old manuscripts. It's a dash, but it's not in a lot of them. So it's in only a few of the documents. And so I'm not sure. I don't think it was in the original. It might have been, but can't tell for sure. So there were no punctuation marks in the early Greek manuscripts. The MSS is abbreviation for manuscripts. I use this here because you need to be aware of it when you're reading in some books. You'll see that they'll talk about the MSS, and that will be manuscripts, plural. MS, singular, one S, M and S is manuscript, a single manuscript. Okay, so we'll be using that later. I'll use that because you need to be aware of it. Just get yourself used to it. I think with it, if you read some books, you'll find it. Moulton, this is a 4-volume set I have. Greek grammar of the New Testament, the grammar, and let's see, I'm just looking at the titles of them. Grammar of the New Testament, volumes 1, 2, and 3, and then Grammar of the New Testament, I guess volume 4, and they just break them down into various parts of it. If they were together, it would be a pretty thick book. It'd be actually thicker than Robertson's big grammar, which is about 1,200 pages. So it'd be a pretty thick book if they had it in one volume. What they say here is this Moulton. There's several men named Moulton that were writers and have written in the Greek area. But ancient writing knew very little of so obvious a help to reading as punctuation. Remember the 3 dots we represent ellipsis. The oldest New Testament, and the NT is New Testament unsealed. Unsealed is what we would call capital letters. Had none of these adjuncts. So the oldest New Testament was all unsealed. It was all caps, all capital letters, what we call capital letters. The correct name for it is unsealed. And it will be clear that there is little probability that any punctuation worth counting, such was present in the New Testament autographs. So you can't make any arguments on punctuation. It has to be, you have to be aware that the punctuation we're going to see is actually the opinion of the translator. Right? Even the Greek text is put in there by the compiler of the text. Okay, Moulton goes in volume 2 of his series, in 4-volume series, apart from the use of this in the semicolon for a query, it's equivalent to our question mark, and the dot above for a colon and a semicolon that functions in both of those. The punctuation for printed Greek testaments is on exactly the same footing as that of the English versions. So the question mark comes in because there are words like why or what, which tell you it's a question. So you'll run into that a lot of times, but there's sometimes they put question marks in there and you can't tell for sure because there's not a marker word. That is a word that would ask a question like how, what, why, when, where, and so forth. So again, sometimes even the semicolon, which is the marker for a question mark, is opinion, okay? And the colon, semicolon as well. Now, there are marker words that will tell you when a new thought begins and stuff like that. And that's really helpful in interpreting. We'll get into that more in the hermeneutics a little bit later. So in the English versions, your punctuation marks are based upon, to some extent, to a large extent, they're based upon the opinion of the translator. Now, most of the time, it's probably good opinion. It's probably right, but you sure don't want to make a doctrinal point that's going to be real critical based upon it unless you have some hard evidence. It's simply, in essence, a form of commentary is what it tells you. And the modern editor is on every page compelled to choose between alternative punctuations involving different interpretation. So what he's telling you, when they put these compiled Greek texts together, you need to be aware that to a large extent, all the punctuation marks they put in there are just that, the opinion of the translator or the compiler of the text in this case, when they're putting together a Greek text from all the manuscripts. Okay, any questions or comments? Powers, in his grammar book, again, I cite him in several of my places here. The Powers, he tells us that's Ward Powers, I think that's his name, Ward Powers. Page 22, he says, if you know Greek, you will therefore be aware that the punctuation in the printed text of the Greek New Testament reflects the judgment, I think, the judgment of the editors. Therefore, at a number of points, it is a matter of interpretation as to whether a particular phrase, clause, or sentence is a question or a statement. So sometimes we don't have a marker word like what, when, where, why, or something like that. That'll tell us it's a question. And so when they put that semicolon there, which is a mark, it's the Greek word symbol for a question mark, it's interpretation of the translator. Okay? That's what he's telling you, Powers is telling his Greek students to be aware of that. Moulton, back to Moulton, and Volume 2, to complete the difference between the modern printed Greek Bible and the early manuscript, UMass singular, there we have the use of a small and convenient minuscule script. All right, now the big script, what we call uppercase, and we looked at that, had a name for it, and that's the uncial. I forgot how to spell it. UNCIL, uncial. And a minuscule, and I think of minuscule, that's the smaller script. It's more like our handwritten script, okay? And so in place of the clumsy space filling capital letters, that's the uncial, which though in early use for non-literary purposes, only in about the 9th century AD began to be applied to books. So the minuscule was existed earlier, but it wasn't put in books. Books were still written in the uncial. So all of the New Testament was written in uncial, uppercase letters. Any question? And originally, right? Century Greek was written in uncial, uppercase letters, with there being no minuscule lowercase letters. Or, in conclusion, then, since it didn't have upper and lowercase letters, any distinction and argument for grammar or argument for doctrinal point on an upper lowercase letter is just that, it's foolishness. You have to go to the context to determine it. So there's no upper and lowercase letters in the original text. Now there happens to be in some of your later intercompiled text, but that's written by hand. Keep that in mind. Therefore, any distinction that's made between upper and lowercase letters is not based on the Greek text. This includes such word things as instance where the word spirit is capitalized. For instance, in Matthew 4:1, then was Jesus led up of the Spirit. That's very standard, is capitalized, in the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. King James Version reads, it was Jesus led up of the Spirit, lowercase spirit, into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. Which one's right? That's the context has to tell us. Is this a disposition or is this the Holy Spirit? That's the question. Right, standard translators take it to be the Holy Spirit, and the King James translators interpret it to be a disposition. Now, there's two editions of the King James Version, which was originally translated in 1611 and brought out in 1611. What happened between 1611 and about 1760, they took 3 or 4 letters out of the English language, took them out. Ampersand is one of them they took out. The horn is another one. And it looks like a Y. And they took it out. It was a TH sound, like a theta. And there was another letter or two that they took out. They changed what that looked like a V, and they changed it to a U and a V. They got 2 letters out of that. And this happened around 1760. They changed it. So the 1611 King James Version had all these other letters in it. And so what they did is the language has changed. And the King of England, he commissioned Oxford and Cambridge universities to come up with revision of the King James Version that would change those letters and update the letter, the spelling. And in the process, they made changes in how it read. The word spirit is in the 1611 King James Version, and a lot of times is lowercase. And the one that we have today might be uppercase. So you'll run into that if you take the 1611 King James Version. Now, these two universities came out with their translations, Oxford and Cambridge, and there are two different editions of it. You can find both of them out there. I think what we're doing, what we're using, the most popular one is the Cambridge edition. I think that's what we have. And yeah, it doesn't matter to me. It's a good translation. I just thought you need to be aware of that. So between 60 and 1769, these two universities had these their own modifications of it. They got together and they published both of them, both editions. And the one that's pretty well stuck, I think, is the Cambridge edition. And so that's, I believe, what we run into now. Our edition of the King James is around 1770, whenever it was finished. It came out around 1769. All right. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's written in some of the old language. Some of the old letters are still in it. All right. In Matthew 12:18, the American Standard reads, 1901 American Standard, I'm not using the New American Standard, I'll call it the New American Standard otherwise. Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I'll put my spirit upon him, uppercase spirit. He shall declare judgment to the Gentiles. King James reads, behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I'll put my spirit, lowercase spirit, upon him. He shall show judgment to the Gentiles. Again, we have a different spelling of the word show, but that's just the older spelling of it. Any comments or questions? What we get into here now is the different translations will have uppercase, lowercase. It's a contextual question every time. Now, if you have the term Holy Spirit, it's pretty well given that that's the third person of the Godhead. Special words in Koine Greek were employed for emphasis. What do we do in spoken English? Well, we raise our voice or inflect our voice, and so we use it voice inflections to tell a lot of times for emphasis. We may get louder, and so we may, say things in a different way. A predicate nominative is also emphatic because it names something twice, and so it's emphatic. A definite article is employed for emphasis a number of times. And again, there are special words, and that we'll get into. Knowing those special words will be helpful in hermeneutics as well. The normal syntax, the order of the words of a sentence is changed for emphasis. There's a normal syntax, but Greek can go in any order. In English, we put the subject first and the predicate second always. That's how you know the subject from the predicate, and by the location of where it is in the sentence. Because we don't inflect, we spell the subject word for the subject the same way we'd spell that same word for if it was a direct object. So that's our problem in English. We have to have the order of the words. That order has to be right. If it's not, that creates problems. But in Greek, it doesn't matter because they inflect it. The nominative case, the subject of the sentence, is inflected a different way and spelled a different way at the end of the word than the direct object, or than the dative case, indirect object, or they have different other cases in Greek that we don't have in English. They have a locative and instrumental case, and then they have a vocative case, a case of addressing somebody, and they have an ablative case, a case of origin or source. Now, so normal syntax is the Greek word for how you place things together, syntaxis, and it's how things are arranged, the order of the words. When it's changed, then that's a matter of emphasis. There are other ways that will not be considered in this study. When I get into the hermeneutics, we'll try to deal with some of them that will help us to see what is emphatic. Every time a personal pronoun is employed with a verb, it's emphatic. The reason being that Greek verbs carry their own subject with them. All Greek verbs have their subject attached to them. We don't have that in English, but when I studied Russian, it had it. And it was inflected like the Greek. In Greek, this is Dana and Maddie's intermediate Greek grammar book. In Greek, the verb expresses its own subject. Ekaruxi means he preached. And consequently, when we express a noun subject of a verb, it is in apposition with the subject implied in the verb itself. So in this case, this says he preached. And the first part up here, I'll move my mouse over, it is preached right in here. And this little epsilon makes it past tense. And the ending is he did it. This is basically like a pronoun he, she, or it, depending on the context. And so we break that up, and this tells us past tense, and it tells us and he or she or it did it. And it would be he preached, and so he preached. And so that verb, when it has a noun, it already has its subject. And so if there's a noun that's there, we'd say Jesus, he preached. That's emphatic. We had Jesus and then Ekaruxi here, and that would be Jesus, he preached. And that would be how we literally translated with not good English, so Jesus preached. But we missed the point that it's emphatic. It's Jesus who's preaching if we had the word Jesus here in front of it. All right. Now then, another thing is if we have a pronoun, it's also emphatic because the ending of that Greek verb is a pronoun. So it already has the pronoun there attached to it. So the pronoun is there twice. If I had a pronoun for he, and then I had this Greek verb up here, let me get my mouse on it. I lose my mouse up here. I had a pronoun in front of it, he, and then had this verb. It would be he preached. Well, that wouldn't be good English, but it's emphatic. And that's what we run into. And that's where knowing elementary Greek could be helpful. It'd be very helpful in interpreting the Bible. Or the more you know about it, the better it's going to be. Summers, that's an elementary Greek grammar book, usually first year. The personal pronouns are not used in the nominative as subjects of verbs, unless, and I would underline that unless there's an emphasis placed on them. They're not needed because the subject is cared for in the personal ending of the verb. It already has its subject attached to it. All verbs have their subject attached to them. Okay. So you have first person verbs, second person, third person, singular, first person plural, second person plural, third person plural, and then have an infinitive form. All verbs will have their subject attached to them already in the personal ending. So when you put a personal pronoun with it, he preached, you doubled it up. It's emphatic. All right. Here's one where we see this. Matthew 5:43 and 44. Ye have heard that it was said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you. And this is really, it's got a pronoun and it's got the word I say. I say. Of course, that wouldn't be good English. I say that you're stuttering. So we don't translate it that way. We miss the thrust of it. It's emphatic. I say, you've heard this said, but I say unto you. See, we would raise our voice if I was preaching, and I would just preach it that way. I'd read it this way. You've heard that was said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy. But I say unto you, that raised my voice a little bit, I love your enemies. When I do that, a lot of times the audience don't know what I'm doing, okay? But I try to do that. If I know it's emphatic right there, raise my voice a bit. That's how we do it in English, or we can put it in bold print if we're writing. We could underline it or something like that, which I have underlined here. Love your enemies and pray for them that persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father. And he goes on. A good translation would be, but even I say unto you. That's okay there, even I. And that way you got the I in there twice. That would not be a bad translation. It would not be nice and flowery like a lot of people would like it to be, but it would be pretty literal. Pretty literal. Gay. Here's another word that's emphatic. And Dana and Mandy, page 260, tell us this word emphasizes usually the word which it's used. It may be translated at least, indeed, or even, or in fact. Sometimes it'll be attached to a word, like our words every and one were put together to make a word everyone, make a single word out of it. So gay is sometimes used to attach to other words. The particle is called a particle. It's not a participle. A particle is kind of a catch-all for words that function pretty much like adverbs most of the time. It's one whose exact force is difficult to define. He tells us this is Moule. Generally, it appears to call attention and lend emphasis to the word or phrase in which it adheres. So it's calling attention to something. So when you see this word, it's calling attention to something. So you kind of say, okay, that's a flag. You can put a flag up right there. That's something to look at carefully. Thus, agay. So what he's done here, and I'll put my mouse over it, agay. See the gay, the gamma epsilons, that's this gamma epsilon that have a mark on it, accent mark, but it's still the same word. That's the first two letters of the word if, and the second one is an emphatic, see. If that is, if indeed, see, if it depends upon the context of the noun. Such a strengthened if implies doubt or a confident assumption. So it could imply doubt, or it could imply assumption that it's true. You have to get that from context. And so the word a is if, see, that first part there, and that's if. This up here is also if. Okay. Gay is found 11 times in the Resistance, not many times, but it's only translated 4. It's not even translated. The effect of the word is lost by lack of translation. We don't see it. We lose the stress of the emphasis that he's making. It's not even translated. It's found in a number of other words in compound form. However, here's a bunch of words where it's found. And we won't go into them because that's something for someone who studied Greek. And it's found in the following words there. These commas are, you can see this first one, the last two letters, and last two letters, last two letters, last two letters. And so this is really 3 words, men, un, and gay, put together as one word. And this is Kai and Toy and gay. 3 words put together, 2 words put together here, 2 words put together here, 2 words put together here. Again, it's emphatic. And so when you see that, it's about emphasis. Right? Now, Greek had 3 ways of saying no or not, to deny something. It had two words. This first word, "oo," it denies something. It denies the fact. So it's used when you're saying something is not a fact. All right. And you can't see it, but I'm gonna hold it up. And I guess I can't get it to my seal and show you my camera, turn it on. But if you were looking at me, I have glasses on. And you could say, okay, these glasses are not, they're not sunglasses. And that's denying that they're regular glasses. They're not sunglasses. See? So I could say that. And I'd use this first Omicron Upsilon. If I was commanding you not to do something, I would use the second one. The second one is an iffy not. No, this is not over here. This is a certain not. It's just denying something to be a fact. Okay. And over here, this second one is an iffy, kind of iffy. It's like you would command someone, don't do that. I don't know whether they'll do it or not. I don't know whether they'll obey me or not, see? And so that's two ways of saying not, and they're used in different structure. The first one will never be used it won't be used with some of the moods. It's generally used with the statement of fact, okay, or this being denial of fact. May over here will be used with your commandments and something that's subjective in nature, or it has to do with character. It's a subjunctive mood, and the same as pretty much like the English subjunctive. Now then, there's another way of saying it. They put the two of them together here, and that's found 10 or 15 times in the New Testament. And then and Manny's tell us that with the light that is the papyri has thrown upon this doubting doubling of the negative, we could say unreservedly that the negatives were doubled for the purpose of stating denials or prohibitions emphatically. So it's an emphatic denial of something. So when you see that, it's very emphatic. And so they put both together, both of these two words. Here, it's found 96 times in the New Testament. And I gave you some passages here. And Matthew 5:20, Luke 22:16, so forth. 1 Corinthians 8:13. It occurs 96 times in the New Testament, this structure does. So it's quite a few times. And it's very emphatic denial of something. Here's one, for example. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no wise. So here it's translated in no wise. They tried to get the emphasis out of it. That's a good translation. In no wise, no way it's going to happen, see. And in no wise, it's absolutely not going to. It's a double negative. And a double negative is not like in mathematics. It doesn't become affirmative positive. In Greek, it's just a strong negative when they use two of them, may and u, together. And there's no way you're going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. That's how we'd say it. No was. That's a good rendering. I like that. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 8:13, wherefore if meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll eat no flesh. He is absolutely negative, both of those together. I am absolutely in no wise will I eat flesh forevermore. Because I don't want to cause anybody to stumble. Any questions? We're not going to go through all 96 of the passages, but when you run into them, that's very emphatic. The predicate nominative, and then many tell us. A further example of the appositional aspect of the nominative is seen as used as predicate. Here its significance of designation is strengthened by making it the thing emphatically defined by the sentence. Now, we could say, and we could say it right now, we could say Joe Biden, President of the United States, did such and such because he's our president at this time. Now, if we say that, Joe Biden is the subject. President of the United States is the predicate nominative. So we're giving more information about him. You could name other people and just do that. We do that quite frequently when we name people, but Something can have a predicate nominative. It tells you more about the subject. And when you do that, you're emphasizing it. It's emphatically defining that person or that thing. A predicate nominative is. All right. So we'll run into that, and there are Greek structures where you can tell the predicate nominative from the subject. If both of them are in the nominative case, the one with the article is the subject, the one without the article is the predicate nominative. Okay. All right. Greek has a structure called the epistolary aorist, and that's when you're writing an epistle. Let me illustrate this. We could say a preacher is writing a bulletin article, or the bulletin is going to be printed on Sunday. Now, we send our bulletins out electronically. If you want it, give me your email address and we'll send it to you. But the bulletin is sent out electronically, usually on a Thursday night. It's probably sent out. I probably will, when I get out of this class, I probably can read the bulletin. But the bulletin may say we're going to have a men's business meeting, or we're going to have something occurring, and or it may even list what's going to be preached. So what we run into is that bulletin is read by most of the people. It's printed out for the people to have when they arrive at services, so they can get the order of service and what's going to be preached and who's going to be preaching and so forth. And so that's like an epistle. If you wrote in the epistle and you wanted to mention something that's happening, you might put it in this form. They're commonly used in epistolary aorist are grapho, I write, and pimpo, I sent. And so in a letter, we could say, I wrote to you, and you're writing a letter, and about second page of the letter, you got 3 pages in your letter, long letter. In the second page somewhere, you say, I wrote to you to send my love to your children. Well, I did that in the first page. And so I'm just referring back to it. And so, but when they receive it, it will be past tense because I wrote it and then sent it to the mail. But we'll have that in the bulletin, and it may say today we'll be doing such and such. Well, but when it was written, it's written on Thursday or Wednesday, and then it was compiled, put together, and then it was emailed out. The people that get it emailed out may get it the day it was written, but usually it may have been written the day before that even. So it's that same form of writing that we'd have in the bulletin, like today we're having a business meeting or whatever, or we're doing such and such. Epistolary aorist, right here is the use of the aorist indicative in the epistle in which the author self-consciously describes the letter from the time frame of the audience. Say, that's Wallace. So like our bulletin articles, like our bulletin. Malton says the aorist is epistolary in style, as in Latin, is logical, since the action so described will be passed at the time the letter is read. So you write it in past tense because it will be past tense when they read it. And so that's something you need to remember. That's a characteristic of the Greek language. It's there a lot of times. Okay. This has a similar syntactical structure. And here's my illustration. The preacher writes in the church bulletin, we will have a business meeting immediately after the worship assembly today. But the bulletin is printed on Friday and distributed on Sunday morning. All right. So you say it's not today when he wrote it, but it's today when they read it. Does that help? Any questions there? Here's an instance where this is employed. But that ye also may know my affairs, how I do. Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, may make known unto you all things, whom I sent unto you for this very purpose. that ye may know our state, and that he may comfort your hearts. I sent him. Well, whenever they get the epistle, it will be past tense. He sent him, and so it's past tense when they read it. So that's exactly what we run into. That's epistolary aorist. Here's another one. It was shown to me that there would be a plot against the man. This is not a writer of the Bible, but it's recorded by Luke. I sent to thee forthwith, charging his accusers also to speak against him before thee. And so this was a man that had set forth to have Paul flogged, beat out of him a confession. But Paul cautioned him, because it's awful for you to do this to a Roman citizen. Of course, you couldn't do that to a Roman citizen. They had special privileges. So right here, he said, well, I sent him to thee forthwith. And so he worded it. You can see he's trying to cover up for what he'd done. He's not wanting to get out what he'd done. Okay. And he charged his accusers also to speak against him. So I charged them. I sent him to you forthwith. Okay. That's 1 Corinthians 5:11, I believe, is the epistolary aorist. But as it is, I wrote unto you not to keep company if any man that is named a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such a one no not to eat. Well, when did he write that? Well, he wrote that in verses 1 through 10. So I don't think it's an epistle that's been lost. I don't believe God allowed any of his words to be lost. I derive that from the incident where the king cut up the writings of Jeremiah, and God wrote it again, wrote some more things to it, added some more stuff. Joachim, with his penknife, cut it up, burned it. So you can't destroy God's word. Men try, but they're evil, and they'll always fail. You can't destroy the word of God. Any questions? So we haven't lost an epistle. Don't worry about that. Ephesians 3:3, how that by revelation was made unto me the mystery, as I wrote before in few words. What few words? That's chapters 1 and 2. And the first two verses of chapter 3. That's what he's talking about. 1 Corinthians 5:9, I wrote unto you by epistle to have no company with fornicators. Well, where did he write it? Verses 1 through 8. That's where he wrote it. Philippians 2:8, Colossians 4:8, Philemon 11, and so forth are examples of epistolary aorist. Any questions or comments? There may be several other instances of this Greek idiom. The word idiom is just a peculiarity. It's not the word idiot. It's a peculiarity of the language. It means, in Greek, it's the Greek word idios, its own. It has its own peculiar characteristic. And so he has an idiom, and so he has a peculiar characteristic that's different. Usually used with the verbs grapho and spimpo. Grapho as I write, spimpo as I said. I think there's another word that I could argue that it's used with, but these are the primary ones. We have also something different in the Greek language that we don't have in English. This is a powerful tool of interpretation. And of course, we get into the Greek, there's a problem here. Greek has active voice, passive voice, and it has a middle voice. And so it has three voices rather than two like we have in English. And the Greek passive voice is pretty much like the English passive voice. The Greek active voice, to a large extent, is the same as our English active voice. But we have another voice that takes part of what we use in English as our active voice, takes part of it away and uses it as a separate voice. That's the middle voice. So it basically does some things that the English active voice does, and the Greek active voice won't be doing those things normally, unless it has a reflexive pronoun, which it can. In the middle voice, the subject is acting so as to participate in some way in the results of the action. This is Davis in his elementary grammar book. Now watch here, there is no English equivalent for this Greek construction. No English equivalent. It's different, it's something unique. The subject rather than the action is a point of emphasis, the subject, not the action. The passive voice is later than the active, and it flowed out, it came out of the middle voice. So the middle voice existed before the passive voice did. The passive voice is later than the active and middle and did not develop distinctive personal endings. The middle and passive are the same in form, except in the future and aorist tenses. Well, that's more than half your verbs will be future and aorist. Aorist is a past tense normally, and the indicative mood release. It's looking at it like a completed act. Okay. And so the present tense is linear durative action, continuous action. But right here, the future and aorist have a different form in passive and mood. Now then, what about the other tenses, the perfect tense and the past, the present tense, and the past perfect, we'll call pluperfect. What about those tenses? For those tenses, the middle and passive are the same in form. So it's a contextual question as to whether it's middle or passive. Okay. But if it's future or aorist, so it has to be over half your verbs. The middle and passive have a different form, but we can tell them from one another. They're distinct. James 4:3. This is middle voice. You ask and receive not because you ask amiss that you may spend it in your pleasures. Well, what does that mean? Let's go back and see it. What he's telling us it means. The subject participates in some way in the action, right? And the subject rather than the action is a point of emphasis. So what's he emphasizing? The subject. You ask, okay, and you don't receive. Why? Because it's a self-centered action on your part. You ask amiss. And the verb, middle voice verb tells us it's self-centered, but he tells us in the last part of the sentence, the last clause, that you may spend it in your pleasures. It's self-centered. But that's your Greek middle voice. They were asking for their own benefit, middle voice, not for the greater good. Greek verb stresses that, tells us that's the case. Of course, we can get that from the verse without knowing this. Sometimes, however, it's real important. We see that middle voice, not as apparent. The Greek has a perfect tense, which is not the same as our English perfect tense. That's a mistake Greek students make. The Greek perfect tense stands alone in its function. Notice I have it underlined, and of course it's not underlined in the original text. I underlined it on purpose for emphasis. English has no corresponding tense adequate for expressing the significance involved. So the English perfect tense is not the same as Greek perfect tense. There's an overlap between them, but they're not one for one equal to each other. What is this perfect tense? This is the Greek tense of completed action. That is, i.e., it indicates completed action with the resulting state of being. The primary emphasis is on the resulting state of being. Involved in the Greek perfect are three ideas. First, an action in progress. Second, it's come to a culmination. Third, it's existing as a completed result. So it's an action in progress coming to a culmination. It culminates and it's existing now as a completed result. Thus, it implies a process, but looks for the process of having reached a consummation and existing as a completed state. That's a pretty good summation of it. I have other books that word it differently, but this is pretty good. I like Summers. That's why I chose his explanation of it. Questions or comments? Okay, we're going to look at an example of it in 1 Corinthians 7:15. Yet, if the unbelieving departed, let him depart. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Not under bondage is Greek perfect tense. Now, let's go back and see what that means. In such case, but God call us to please. Let's look at it again. What does it indicate? Three things. It indicates an action in progress, coming to upon a culmination and existing as a completed result. So it's an action in progress, not under bondage, and not under bondage. It's come to a culmination. They're still not under bondage, see? And the culmination, the completed process, they're still not under bondage. Never have been under bondage, they're not under bondage. So he's telling us marriage is not a bondage. Never has been. Never was. Never was intended to be a bondage by God. Never was a bondage if it followed God's will. I'm not saying it's not bondage in some societies which have corrupted God's will, but I'm saying it's not in God's will a bondage. It's not slavery. Questions or comments? Marriage is not and never has been bondage or slavery. This is the thrust of the Greek perfect tense. Okay, any questions? There are other aspects of both Hebrew and Greek grammar and syntax that affect our interpretation of scriptures that we haven't considered in this brief study. And that would enhance the understanding of scripture by study of both Hebrew and Greek. That would be helpful. Our school, we have on YouTube, we have a class that's been recorded for approximately nearly 2 years of Greek grammar and syntax. Nearly 2 years college level. Okay. So let us summarize it, and if you are interested, you can view these and we can get you the book, an electronic copy of the book. We'll not summarize these points here. We won't summarize because there's too scattered out, there's too many different points. Does anybody have a question or comment?